begin by thanking Hillel and Eva for the use of their home. It's a pleasure to inaugurate our series here. So let's begin with an introduction to the study of the Jewish history of the period that we've chosen. And just to be clear, the period that we have chosen, or that I have chosen, and not arbitrarily, and you've chosen simply because I chose it, is the period between the resettlement of the Jews in the Promised Land, in the Holy Land, after the first exile. We refer to the Jews as the Babylonian exile, but we are in fact resettled in the land of Israel by the Persians, so the Persian period, all the way through till the final revolt, the last jolt of rebellion by the Jews against the Romans through the person who we know historically as Bar Kokhba, although that was not his real name. It's a period that begins in the 6th century before the Christian era and ends in the year roughly 135 of the Christian era. So we're talking about a period of more or less 700 years. I want to begin with a term of reference question. It's not going to be the only one. We're going to do several term of reference questions, and I invite participation from you guys because I think that it will help you understand if you participate or listen to others who do. What is meant, in your view, by the word or the term Judaism? It's a very important question. You'll see why. Anyone have an answer? What is meant by the term Judaism? Go ahead.
Tribe of Judah.
Tribe of Judah. That's not what Judaism means. Judah, maybe Jews is that. Judah. What is Judaism? We describe our religious faith as Judaism. What is that? Yes?
A culture.
It's a culture. So that when we describe Jewish history and we describe Judaism in Jewish history, we're describing a culture of the Jews. It's a broad term.
A religion also.
A religion. So which religion of Judaism? What would you exclude from the term Judaism? That's a very important question.
Yes.
What would you exclude from the term Judaism?
Today, contemporary term? Or you...
I'm not talking about that. Well, we obviously judge it as contemporaries. I'm now asking, if you look back in Jewish history, what is Judaism? If we're describing, we want to do the history of the Jews, who are we describing? Whose history are we describing?
Monotheistic.
Monotheistic faith.
There's a lot of...
There's a lot of it. Christians are monotheistic.
Right.
So are they Jews? Islam. Go ahead.
The people who received the Torah at Mount Sinai.
That's a very specific period. After that, what about their great-grandchildren? Were they Jews?
They're still who follow the derivative values of the Torah.
So Sadducees were Jews.
Yes. Well, no, because they didn't. What they did was
They wouldn't agree with you.
No, they followed the Torah itself, but not any of the oral law that explained it.
But they would tell you that those oral obligations were not mentioned in the Torah, therefore they're no less Jews.
I wouldn't include.
Of course you wouldn't. You see how difficult it is to define the term.
But the authority.
In the broader sense,
authority of the rabbi.
Judaism are people who identify with Jewish history, meaning their origins from the time of Abraham to the Exodus in Egypt. So it's not identification with history, which the Sadducees and other sects do.
And the Christians.
So an identification with Jewish history. Number two, and a belief in and observance of Jewish law, which again is a broad term because it involves the Torah, they involve the Mishnah and the Talmud. And thirdly, the relationship with the land of Israel as a designated land that God designated for the Jewish people. So in broad terms, those three aspects define Judaism.
Okay, I'm not going to take any more answers. That is a very, I guess, comprehensive answer, but you carry in it the bias of your own experience as a Jew living in the 21st century. And I guess if you would have asked a Dead Sea sectarian, or if you would have asked an early Christian, and by the way, it's not that hard to ask an early Christian, you can see what they were saying if you read the New Testament, they wouldn't agree with that definition of what it means to be a Jew. So Judaism, as we understand it, and in a way, I know I mentioned it a few weeks ago in the Tefillah notebook, that history belongs to the victor, right? We're the ones who, I guess, won the long-term battle. But in a sense, the Judaism that we practice is not the Judaism that was practiced by many people who called themselves Jews in history. And the reason I'm saying all this as a way of defining the series that we're going to be doing is because there's a very big difference between a history of the Jews and a history of Judaism. And what we describe as Judaism is described by the scholars as normative Judaism, or more correctly perhaps Rabbinic Judaism. We practice something called Rabbinic Judaism. The Judaism that we practice is almost nothing to do with the Judaism, for example, that was practiced in the time of the first Beit HaMikdash, the first temple. There was no 3 times a day tefillah in a shul. There may have been laws of Eruv, but they certainly weren't as sophisticated as the ones that we have now. Many of the rabbinic laws that we are extremely familiar with would have been totally foreign to the Jews of the first temple period. Fervent Jews, devout Jews, but their Judaism was extremely different to the Judaism that we have today. Are they less Jewish? Is their Judaism worse than ours? It's different, but if you want to do a history of Judaism, you have to do a history of the evolution of Judaism from whatever that was to whatever it is now, and see if there is a connection. There were plenty of Jews. You mentioned a connection to the land of Israel. You're going to hear about people whose connection with the land of Israel had diminished to such an extent that they built their own temples outside of Israel. At least 2 that we know of, where they brought sacrifices, not only to what we call God, but to local pagan gods, and they called themselves Jews. Now we are familiar with the rabbinic tradition that a Beit HaMikdash cannot be built outside of Jerusalem once the Temple of Solomon was built. And yet there they are. There's architectural remains and there are documentary remains of temples that existed, were functioning, active for many, many years, hundreds of years outside the land of Israel, and run by people who considered themselves to be fervent religious Jews.
And the Korban?
With korbanot. So, I beg your pardon?
Where?
In Egypt. Mainly, both of them were in Egypt.
They didn't obey the 10 Commandments?
They obeyed the 10 Commandments, but they didn't consider bringing sacrifices to pagan gods as going against the 10 Commandments. But we're going to deal with that. We're going to get to it. It's a fascinating chapter that I'm guessing a lot of people here have never heard of. I want to refer to Rabbinic Judaism as the Judaism that became the standard for the development of Judaism in the periods that followed the resettlement of Jews in the land of Israel. But there were many other Judaisms, and I feel that we should be describing the periods that we're discussing as 3: Persian, Hellenistic and Roman. That's what we're going to be looking at. Today we're going to be looking at the Persian period. And the rough dates of these periods are the 6th century to the 4th century is the Persian period, and the Hellenistic period is the 4th century, so let's call it the 2nd or 1st century CE, and then from the 1st century onwards for about 200-300 years until the 2nd century of the Christian era was the Roman period. Christianity is based on the Hebrew Bible. Early Christians, and they're known in the various churches of the Christian faith as the Church Fathers, called the New Testament, they created their own Bible, which they called the New Testament. We're going to talk about something called canonization of the Bible, because the period that we're describing is a time when the Bible was still being written. It's a dynamic period in terms of the Bible. We look at the Bible as being some book that was dropped from heaven and suddenly landed in somebody's lap and we opened it and read it. But no, it was still being written in the time that we're describing. So after the destruction of the first Beit HaMikdash, before the second Beit HaMikdash was built, and even after it had been built, there were books of the Bible that were being written that hadn't been finished. So we're going to be offering an insight into the Judaism of the Talmud and compare Rabbinic Judaism to its main competitor, early Christianity, using the lens of objective historical research and analysis. At least that's what we're going to be trying to do. Now, before I continue, I would like to, if possible, look at the maps which you have in front of you. If you look at the top map, forget the shaded areas for a moment. This was the known ancient world. This top map, bottom map, the known ancient world stretched from Egypt all the way through to Media. Okay, Persia and Media are what are known in the Megillas Esther, as Paras Umodai. Babylonia is Bovel. Sumeria and Elam, this is the birthplace of Abraham Avinu. Then we see to the north where it says Turkey. That's kind of beyond the pale. It's the edges of the Persian Empire. The Fertile Crescent stretched from Egypt beyond the map all the way through as a crescent shape to where it says Media and Persia. That was where civilization lived. So when we describe the stories of the Bible, we're talking about the Fertile Crescent, that space, tiny space, between Egypt and Media and Persia. Everything in between. This was the Babylonian Empire. The top map is the Babylonian Empire, and this is where our story begins, because Nebuchadnezzar, Melech Babel, the king of Babel, came and conquered the land of Israel, ransacked the temple, and took the vast majority of the inhabitants of the land of Israel back to Babylon, and they moved from there to Media and Persia, and that's where they lived. At some stage, we're going to hear about the Persian Empire, and the Persian Empire, which is represented by the yellow in the bottom map, got the better of the Babylonian Empire, and they took over the entire landmass that was at one time controlled by Babylon, now became controlled by Persia. So in the year 539, Cyrus the Great, we're going to be hearing about him, Koresh in our Tanakh, conquered the Babylonian Empire, and for some 200 years, the Persians were really in control of what's referred to as the Near East. Whilst you're looking at that map, those maps, I want to explain to you that there's a limitation in what we're going to be doing today, in the sense that I don't feel that we can describe economic history or social history, and in terms of dealing with political, economic or military factors as they affected the history of Judaism, we're going to only deal with them in as much as when they did affect Judaism or Jews. We cannot possibly deal with economic history is a study of history on its own. Social history is a study of history on its own. We have to focus on our chosen subject because of the limitation of the time that we have. I also will help if we understand what a sect is, because we described before sects of Judaism. A sect of Judaism, I think it's fair to say, is a group of Jews who practice what they understand to be Judaism, but who do it in a different way than another group of Jews who are doing their form of Judaism. And there's a dispute between the two sects as to what the correct way, what the correct fashion of performing some Jewish rite should be. So if we're going to learn in a later lecture about the Dead Sea sectarians who hived themselves off to Qumran and lived in caves or those who lived in the desert, the Essenes, they practiced a form of Judaism that they felt was incompatible with the Judaism of the Jews that were living in the cities. It doesn't mean that the Jews who were living in the cities weren't themselves practicing Judaism or didn't think that they were. They absolutely felt that they were. But there was conflict in terms of the definition of what it meant to practice Judaism, and different sects grew and became dynamic in and of themselves in conflict with other similar groups. That's what a sect of Judaism was. They prevailed, sects of Judaism prevailed during the period of the Second Temple, mainly in the period of the late Second Temple period. Just tell you a little anecdote. I wrote my dissertation, I think it's on the flyer, about sectarian movements in the late Second Temple period. And in fact, the long and fairly boring title of my dissertation was A Study of Sectarian Movements in the Late Second Temple Period in Light of Discoveries at Qumran. And I wrote this dissertation over the period of several months using multiple sources for information. And one of the sources I used was obviously the New Testament, because the New Testament contains a lot of valuable information about that period. My grandfather, some of you may have seen his photo either in my house or in my office, was a very distinguished Haredi rabbi. And he came to my house with his long beard and black hat, and he noticed on my shelf copies of the New Testament. And he knew I'd gone to college. I'm one of 100 of his grandchildren. I'm the only one who's got a university degree. And I guess he wondered how far I'd gone in my college career and whether he'd actually lost me to the faith. And he took it off the shelf and he opened it up and he said, "Pini, you've got a copy of the New Testament." I said, "Yes, Grandpa, I showed you my dissertation. I needed it for historical research purposes." And he nodded and stroked his beard and he said, "1 copy I understand, but 6?" But this leads me neatly into a brief discussion about sources, because sources are really important. Theological sources as historical sources, that was the title for tonight. I wanted to stress it. I think it's really important. What is the problem, for example, if you treat the Torah as a historical source, or if you treat Nevi'im or Ketuvim as a historical source? The problem inherent in treating any theological text as a source is that actually a theological text isn't there to tell you a story. It's there to give over theology. It's there to give you faith. It's there to get you to understand God better. Every week I stand up and I give a sermon and I take some verse from the Torah and I describe why that verse has something to say to you and me, and why it's relevant, even though it was written 3,500 years ago, why it's relevant to you and me. Now, if it's just a story, if I were to be studying a book about Napoleon or William the Conqueror, and there was some sentence or some chapter in that book about William the Conqueror coming across from Normandy to England in 1066, and I would say, that really teaches me a very important lesson about God, you'd think I was ridiculous. Because the story of William the Conqueror isn't a theological text. The stories of Avraham Avinu and Yaakov Avinu and the Shevatim and all the stories that we have going throughout Tanakh, all the way through to the final prophets that we're going to be describing, are all theological texts. To treat them purely as historical narrative, or to in fact extrapolate out of them historical facts and say that some other historical fact that you may know from another source can't be true because the Torah says, or Nevi'im says ABC, is not understanding the function and the purpose of the Torah. The truth of Torah is not to be found in the narrative. The truth of the Torah is to be found in the theological message it contains. and however the story is delivered to us, that there is a lesson for us there, but it's not a history lesson. The critical use of primary sources is problematic, though. So if we're going to treat the Torah in a critical sense, or in a modern understanding of what that means, not like Rashi and Ibn Ezra, but to treat it in the sense that the Torah is fairy tales, there's a problem there for us. So we have to understand that despite the fact that the narrative of the Torah is not there to teach us history, we can't drift that far away from the Torah that the Torah suddenly becomes a myth, a fable, a fairy tale. So we have to find a way of dealing with that tension. And that's really important for at least a Jewish historian, or a Jewish historian who wants to have respect and be able to validate that which is written in the Torah from a perspective that he'll understand. So, I'm going to describe some primary sources that we use to describe or understand this period. The obvious one, of course, is the Hebrew Bible. And in terms of the period that we're talking about Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi, Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. These are the books in the canonized Tanakh that we have that describe historical events that we can identify with similar, events described elsewhere in other historical sources. Those are the ones that we look at in terms of history. I'm hopefully going to get to one tonight which is absolutely fascinating. Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha. Anyone know what those are?
Those are books that weren't accepted into the canonized
By who?
Bible by the rabbis.
By the rabbis. So there is some stage at which, let's not call them rabbis, Jewish religious leadership, I think would be a more correct term, decided that there were books that were written, and by the way, if you look at some of these books, Chanoch is a book you may have heard of. Chanoch is a book that was written in a biblical style. If you read it, it doesn't read any different than Megillas Esther. It doesn't read any different than Ezra and Nehemiah. And yet, it's not included in Tanakh. Now, Apocrypha and Pseudepigrapha are more or less the same thing. The only difference being, were they ever accepted by anyone else as being canonized? So the Apocrypha were accepted by some people, but not accepted by others. Pseudepigrapha were more or less not accepted by anybody except for some minor sects of Christianity. Tanakh, that means our books of the Bible, were accepted by everybody who treats the Bible as a theological source book. So everybody accepts our Tanakh. There are Christian sects who accept the Apocrypha, some who don't, and some very minor sects who accept books of the Pseudepigrapha. The Apocrypha were included in the Septuagint, which was the Greek translation of the Bible, which we'll also be dealing with at a later stage. The Dead Sea Scrolls I've mentioned already, discoveries at Qumran. You mentioned that you know Professor Qumran. That's a whole subject matter on its own. The Dead Sea Scrolls is something which we'll deal with probably in the third or fourth lecture, depending how long each one takes. We're going to be dealing with this extremely valuable resource. These were scrolls that were discovered in 1947, quite by accident. A Bedouin shepherd boy stumbled into a cave, saw a bunch of earthenware jars which had been preserved in the very unique dry heat of the desert. He broke one open. It's full of scraps of manuscripts. He imagines that they're not that old. He takes them to the nascent Jewish university, Hebrew University in Jerusalem. They're examined by a professor, and he says, we have discovered original texts of the Hebrew Bible that date from the Second Temple period. They're dated roughly from 200 years before the Christian era, and they stop abruptly around the time of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash, so 70 years of the Christian era. So that's 270 years worth of scroll material. If any of you have been to the Shrine of the Book, and my wife is very fond of telling the story about how I took her on her date to the shrine of the book. Not the most exciting or romantic date of all the ones I took her on, I have to say. But fascinating for me, nonetheless. You've got the entire Isaiah, Yeshaya scroll, which has been unfurled, unrolled, and you can see Yeshaya in the same way that we have it in our Tanakh. Almost word for word, identical with our Masorah of how Yeshaya has been given and handed over to us over the tradition, the generations, and we have it today. But the Dead Sea Scrolls didn't just contain biblical material, it contained very important descriptive material of the group that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. Descriptive both in terms of their theology and in terms of their way of life. That's a source material. The works of Philo of Alexandria and Josephus Flavius, two Greek-speaking Jews, one lived in Alexandria, one lived in Judea. They recorded Jewish history. They were minor people in their time. The only reason they've become famous is because of Christianity. Had they recorded the history of some other minor group of the Near East, no one would have remembered Josephus, no one would have remembered Philo. But because Christianity has its origins in Judaism, and they both describe the period in which Jesus Christ lived, they became extremely important in terms of the history of Christianity. And because of that, we Jews have benefited because we have these source books, these source materials available to us, although they are both flawed, very flawed as historical sources for different reasons. Josephus in particular was an apologist. An apologist, or apology in terms of somebody who writes a descriptive book, a history book, or any type of contemporary work. An apologist is somebody who is desperately trying to ingratiate himself with a particular group who may possibly be opposed to the group that he belongs to. So somebody who is, perhaps you'd have in this country, Muslim apologists, who are desperately trying to present a positive face of Islam in a country which has latent animosity towards Islamic fundamentalism. I'm just giving one example. In ancient history, you had tremendous animosity towards the monotheistic faith of the time, which was Judaism, by the vast majority of pagans who lived then. And Josephus Flavius was somebody who felt he wanted to present the face of Judaism in a way that would make Jews look good and make Judaism look good. And that was his agenda. So everything that you see in Josephus has to be examined under that lens, has to be seen in terms of how he is describing something and whether or not he has a hidden agenda or not so hidden agenda to present Jews in a different way than they actually were, so that people would like the Jews. The New Testament we've already described. It offers an account of the emergence of Christianity through the eyes of early Christians. There's a lot of valuable information in the New Testament. And then we have rabbinic literature, Mishnah, Tosefta, the Jerusalem Talmud, or the Palestinian Talmud as it's sometimes called, the Babylonian Talmud, Midrashim. They're primarily legalistic and homiletic material, and they were compiled over several centuries, and even after the era that we're going to be describing, from the late Greek period until the end of the Rabbinic period, which was in the 6th century. They contain a lot of traditions that were recorded and only written down later on, mythical material, interesting cultural material, and of course the legalistic arguments that we're so familiar with as Jews, which are the backbone, which are the fundament of the Jewish faith. The very fundament of the way we run our lives is the words of the Talmud and the words of the Midrash. Archaeological evidence is the final one, and I think in the third week I'm going to be bringing a collection of coins that I have, which have been found in the land of Israel. I have quite a collection of interesting Second Temple coins, which you'll all be able to see, including a half shekel coin, which are extremely rare. They teach us a lot about the era as well. We learn from inscriptions, we learn from little jugs, oil jugs that are found, we learn from all types of things that have been found, archaeological digs, and even as recently as a few weeks ago, they discovered in the vicinity of the Temple Mount
Right.
evidence of Jews having lived there in a particular period which they didn't have evidence for. It's extremely important to treat archaeological material and venerate it, because it teaches us things that we can't possibly learn from the primary sources. When you can touch something, you can feel something, you can see something, it gives texture to that which we study in a book. Now, one of the extremely important parts of history, or at least the study of history in the context that we're doing it, is historiography. Anyone know what historiography is? It's a long word. My dissertation was historiography. Historiography is the study of history. It's the study of how history itself has been written or handed down. And what is the development of a historical narrative over time? How has that narrative developed? How has it evolved so that we see it in the way that we do? Historiography takes into consideration the various means by which a historical source is formed, such as the credibility of the sources which are used, the motives of the author composing the history, often an anonymous author. Most of the authors that we deal with are not Josephus or Philo. We don't know who they were. And we have to find out what could possibly have motivated them to write in a particular way so that we have the history in the way that we do. How authentic is it? We mentioned again, Josephus. Is Josephus telling the story of the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash? Can he be believed? Is his role to be believed? He takes a central role in many of the things that happened. He is the one who discusses this with the Roman general and discusses that with the Jewish rebel. Can he be taken seriously, or is he creating a dramatic narrative to make his readers more interested in the topic that perhaps would have bored them? Historiography can be regarded as a form of meta-history, another word which probably many of you are not familiar with. Meta-history is something which you probably are much more familiar with than you realize, and I'll tell you why. Meta-history is concerned with the nature of history, the meaning of history and the cause and significance of historical change. What I mean is that a historian is primarily engaged in the study of the past. What happened in 1863? Where did he go from here? And how did he get there? It's factual, it's facts. That's a historian's task. He looks for evidence and he reproduces that evidence, maybe even theoretical evidence, and tries to create a narrative, but it's a study of a story. A meta-historian wants to understand the past in terms of what preceded it and what it means for the present. So it's very similar to the way we examine Bible narrative, that you and me, when we learn a Dvar Torah, we're meta-historians. We don't look at a story of Yetziat Mitzrayim simply in terms of what year did it happen and which pharaoh was it. That may be of interest to us, but what's really of interest to us is how did the crucible of Yetziat Mitzrayim create the Jewish people? We're all meta-historians. That's what we're doing on Seder night. When we sit down to the Seder, we're meta-historians. We go through the narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim in such a way as to give us some outcome that's relevant to us. Not that it's a story that happened in ancient history. When we sit on Tisha B'Av and we sit on the ground and we commemorate and are sad at the destruction of the temple, we're taking meta-history to an extreme. We become extreme meta-historians because we want to infuse in ourselves that feeling of what it meant to lose the temple, to lose the center of Jewish life. And we're going to be trying to do that in this group of lectures. A very important question to consider is how non-Jews affected Judaism. And we're always familiar with this question because of Christianity and Islam, but I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about non-Jews of the ancient world. How did they affect Judaism? Throughout the Second Temple, throughout this period that we're going to be describing, the Jews fell under the influence and were more or less controlled first by Persians, then by Greeks, and then by Romans. Those people imposed rules, taxes. They fought wars, either against the Jews or with the Jews. there were different forces with whom the Jews joined. To what extent did those alliances or those enemies affect Judaism as a faith? It's a very important question. It becomes particularly important at around the time when Christianity emerged, or at least when Jesus lived, and when the Second Temple was destroyed. Further factors that may have affected Judaism were the techniques by which Judaism was developed. So we are all familiar with the fact that the Torah tells us things that we just cannot possibly understand if we take them at face value. Don't cook a kid in its mother's milk. Right, I never do that anyway. But it says it 3 times. So what does that mean? That requires an interpretative system. We are all familiar with that system. But how did that system start? When did it start? What is the first evidence of such a treatment of the Torah? When we know and we are familiar with the fact that when it says in the Torah, an eye for an eye, and we don't gouge people's eyes out when they gouge someone else's eye out, when did that begin, that interpretative system that dictated that an eye for an eye is a financial compensation, not gouging out somebody else's eye? That's an important development in Judaism. It's important to understand how that evolved. And finally, survival of the fittest. It is a fact that history belongs to the victor, however you're going to present it. It's a terrible oversimplification. But here we are, rabbinic Jews, 2,500 years after the period we're beginning to describe took place. We're still here. We have a very complex, very intricate system of Judaism that we practice, that we recognize, and that we understand. How did that happen? How did we survive? Are we more worthy as survivors than those who may have existed at that time? Why was it that those others didn't survive? What historical forces and what forces, societal forces, caused them to become extinct and allowed us to thrive and survive? So, there is something called modernity. I think you're all familiar with it. Modernity is a new reality that challenges previous accepted practice, whatever that practice may have been. Our chosen period represented the second of 4 times that Judaism has faced the challenges of modernity. And the 4 periods are when the Israelites invaded and conquered Canaan, and encountered the pervasive influence of a Canaanite pagan culture. The whole of Tanakh, the early part of Tanakh, is full of these encounters and how the Jews either succeeded or failed in their attempts to reconcile themselves with what was going on around them. That was period number 1. Our period is the challenge of Hellenism and Roman culture during the Second Temple period. That incredibly intense competition between competing cultures and competing philosophies. The Jewish ideal and the Greek and then the Roman ideals is something which is really a driving force here in this period. The third period, just for those who are taking notes, the challenge of the dominance of the Islamic civilization and or Christianity during the Middle Ages. That's one which we're familiar with in more recent history. And much more recently is the challenge of enlightenment and atheism in the modern era, which is the one, of course, with which we are familiar today. So we're going to look at how Judaism adapts itself to modernity in the chosen period, but of course it will apply to a certain extent to our own period as well. Cyrus the Great. That's who we're going to be talking about now. If you'll give me 15 minutes, I'll give you a fascinating description of a conflict between something that we have in Tanakh and something which we have in archaeology. I'm only so desperately upset that I didn't give this series of lectures much earlier in my tenure as rabbi of the shul, because, believe it or not, the Cyrus Cylinder, which hasn't left the British Museum for something like 100 years, was here in Los Angeles for 3 weeks. In the Getty Museum, and they extended it by another week. It left on December the 8th, and here I am. It's the 9th of January, just 1 month later, and I would have loved to have taken you all to see the Cyrus Cylinder. I saw it in the British Museum. I didn't go here, but we're going to talk about it. The last years of the Babylonian exile and the early years of resettlement are referred to as the Persian period, because the land of Israel and the whole of the Near East, and I've used that term already, that two-word term, the Near East. The Near East is what we today in modern times refer to as the Middle East, but excludes Egypt. So all that part of the Middle East that isn't Egypt is known by history scholars as the Near East. It was absorbed by conquest, as you saw on your maps, into the Persian Empire, and the king of Persia who was responsible for this was a man called Cyrus the Great. He lived from 600, or around 600 before the Christian era, and he died at around 530 before the Christian era, which is a very old age for those days. He was a 70-year-old man. In 539, he took over the Babylonian Empire. In 538, apparently, Cyrus the Great issued a decree, which is also referred to by the Cyrus Cylinder. We're going to deal with that in a moment. Questions to consider, which we won't be able to answer tonight, is, did all the Jews move back to the land of Israel? The answer is no. That's interesting in and of itself. They hadn't been gone for that long. Why did Cyrus the Great issue a decree at all to let the Jews go back to the land of Israel? Just a very brief period before, in terms of history, they'd all been banished from the land of Israel. Why would he have let them come back? They were a threat to the Babylonian Empire. Wouldn't they then become a threat to the Persian Empire? That's a question to consider. And what was, of course, my favorite question tonight, what was the Judaism of that time? What are we talking about? I'm going to get to that, hopefully. First, let me find my relevant piece of paper. There we go. Cyrus's famous edict, and that's how we're going to end tonight. Historians generally view Cyrus the Great as an emperor who approached the cultures and religions within his empire with strategic tolerance. If you want to understand the man, you have to understand the man as a great strategist or strategist. I'm not trying to pronounce it here in America. They see Cyrus as a brilliant military and political tactician, and they view his tolerance to be a mere extension of strategy, in the sense that it created unity and discouraged rebellion, thereby strengthening the Persian Empire. Now, I'm going to examine over the next 10-12 minutes whether this view of Cyrus is correct, and we're going to look at two sources. We have two primary texts relating to him, one from what has become known as the Cyrus Cylinder, and the other from the Book of Ezra. Let me see if I can find my Book of Ezra here. Does someone have one for me? I'm not sure I have it here. I do. So, we have here the first 8 psukim of Ezra, which we're going to look at. During the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, I'm reading the English. Those of you who read Hebrew will see a finer version of this text in the Hebrew. So that the word of God by the mouth of Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu, might be accomplished, God stirred up the spirit of Cyrus, the king of Persia, and he made a proclamation throughout his kingdom, and put it also in writing. He put it in writing. So we know for sure that this declaration, this decree is recorded. You're going to see that's important. It said as follows: So says Cyrus, king of Persia, all the kingdoms of the earth have been given to me by God, God of heaven, and he has obligated me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, of the Jews in other words, his God should be with him. let him go up to Jerusalem, which is in Judah, and build the house of God, the God of Israel. He is the God who is in Jerusalem. And whoever is left in any place where he dwells, let the men of his place help him with silver and with gold and with goods and with beasts, besides for the gifts for the house of God which is in Jerusalem. Probably referring to the annual gift of the shekel, the chatzi shekel, machzis shekel, which was an annual tax. In addition to that annual tax, give whatever you can to enable the people who are going to be rebuilding the temple to go to Jerusalem and do their job. Then the heads of fathers' houses of Judah and Benjamin arose, and the priests, and the Levites, all of those whose spirit God had stirred to go up and build the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. And all those that were around them strengthened their hands with vessels of silver, with gold, with goods, and with beasts, and with precious things, besides for all that was given. Also, Cyrus the king brought out the vessels of the house of God, the Klei HaMikdash, the holy vessels that were taken by Nebuchadnezzar and put in the house of his gods. Cyrus, king of Persia, brought them out by the hand of Mithridat, the treasurer, and numbered them. In other words, gave them over one by one. That's how precious they were. To Sheshbatzar, the prince of Judah. Sheshbatzar we'll hear about perhaps next week. This is the declaration of Cyrus as it's recorded in the text of our Tanakh. It's in Ksuvim. Ezra Nehemiah is in Ksuvim. It's the last book of Ksuvim. We're all familiar with it, or we should be if we've read through the Tanakh. It's been familiar to rabbis and scholars of the Bible for thousands of years. Well, you know what? There's another record of the same declaration, so it would seem. The Cyrus cylinder. It's a clay cylinder. You see it described here. I've just taken this from the British Museum website. This is not a sophisticated text that I've written. It was discovered at some point, and we have a translation of what's written in that text. What I've done is I've emboldened some of the important references in that declaration, which is much longer than the one we have recorded in Ezra. Exalted Marduk, Enlil of the gods, relented, and he took under his hand Cyrus, king of the city of Anshan, and called him by his name, proclaiming him aloud for the kingship over all of everything. So far, can you see any difference between the one we've got and the one they've got? Somebody called Marduk here doesn't sound like the god of the Hebrews. Certainly nothing, no mention here of Jerusalem. Marduk, the great Lord, who nurtures his people, saw with pleasure his fine deeds and true heart, and ordered that he should go to Babylon. Okay, so we have here some deity, some god, who is the force behind Cyrus the Great, and guiding his hand in his conquest against Babylon. And now we have the declaration itself. I am Cyrus, king of the universe. Very small-headed man. The great king, the powerful king, king of Babylon. I sought the welfare of the city of Babylon and all its sanctuaries. You can read the rest as well, but I just want to get to the most important part of the text. Marduk, the great Lord, rejoiced at my good deeds, and he pronounced a sweet blessing over me. From Shuan I sent back to their places to the city of Ashur and Shushan. Akkad, the land of Eshnuna, the city of Zamban, the city of Metornuder, as far as the border of the land of Kutu, the sanctuaries across the river Tigris. Now that sounds familiar. The sanctuaries across the river Tigris, whose shrines had earlier become dilapidated. The gods who lived therein and made permanent sanctuaries for them. I collected together all of their people and returned them to their settlements. And the gods of the land of Shumer and Akkad, which Nabonidus, to the fury of the Lord of the gods, had brought into Shuana at the command of Marduk the great Lord, I returned them unharmed to their cells in the sanctuaries that make them happy. May all the gods that I return to their sanctuaries every day before Marduk and Nabu ask for a long life for me, and mention my good deeds, and say to Marduk, my lord, this, Cyrus, the king who fears you, and Cambyses his son, may there ... I'm just reading what's printed here by the British Museum. It's very familiar. It sounds as if it's describing the same scene as that which was described in Ezra. And yet it's materially different. And I want to describe that because that's a puzzle that has vexed scholars. And I'm an Orthodox Jew. I took Jewish history. I'm sensitive to history, and I'm sensitive to the theological outcome of something which is as conflicted as this. The scripture on the Cyrus Cylinder, which is an ancient Babylonian dialect, appears to be a declaration from the Persian king that both asserts the emperor's power and might, and also decrees a tolerance towards cultures within the empire that is manifested in an allowance of tribes, cults and religions to rebuild their national and or cultural shrines. The words on the Cyrus Cylinder speak of an ancient pagan deity by the name of Marduk, and asserts that Cyrus not only respects but actually also believes in Marduk, in this god. A similar but materially different declaration that's recorded in Ezra is also a declaration from Cyrus, but doesn't assert the monarch's power as such. It demonstrates the throne's humility and subservience to the Jewish God. The words in the Hebrew Bible also seem to be exclusively directed towards the Jewish people and their national shrine, the Beit HaMikdash in Jerusalem, mentioned several times. I highlighted it each time I mentioned it. The Bible mentions nothing, our Ezra mentions nothing of any other shrine, any other god, or any other religion being reinstated and repatriated as a result of Cyrus's magnanimity. So what do we have here? Which declaration is the real one? Were there two declarations? Is it possible that both declarations could coexist? Actually, they're parallel. One's got nothing to do with the other. So I'm going to go through a number of possible approaches to this particular puzzle, briefly, and it's a big subject, worthy of a much more professional treatment than the one I'm going to give it now, but I feel that it's something I want to share with you and that you'll walk away with and enjoy. It is possible to say that Cyrus issued one decree to all of his empire, allowing for the rebuilding of national shrines, and an entirely separate decree to the Jewish people, allowing for the rebuilding of their temple. This possibility is, to be perfectly honest, I have to say, highly unlikely, as the Persian emperor would most likely not have issued a redundant decree, I would think, if a previous decree included the same exact directive. Everyone rebuild your temple, and now the Jews rebuild your temple. Oh, didn't you just tell us that 5 minutes ago? Why are you telling us again? So even if such an interpretation is plausible, so let's at least live in that parallel universe where we're going to say that there were two decrees, there's a problem that arises within the text of Ezra itself. What is that problem? Well, the Bible asserts that Cyrus, Koresh, was a believer in the Jewish God, and that his belief in God profoundly affected his political decisions in that it imbued within him a righteous spirit to help the Jews. That's what it says in Ezra. So while Cyrus may have issued a kind-worded decree to the Jews that praised their God, the Cyrus Cylinder demonstrates that he was equally willing to lend validity to the pagan deity Marduk. That doesn't really chime very well with our understanding of what it means to be a monotheist. Now, given other historical evidence that Cyrus was affected by Zarathustra's teachings and that he never practiced a single religion, it is clear that the king's references to Marduk and or the Jewish God were not religiously motivated. It is logical to say that Cyrus's decision to respect the gods of his subjects was completely politically motivated, and that it was most likely a manifestation of his larger desire to appeal to his subjects and instill in them a respect and loyalty towards his empire. So this seems to fly in the face of the assertion in the Book of Ezra that Cyrus was religiously motivated. He was infused with the Spirit of God, and that's why he told the Jews to go back to the land of Israel. That's what we read in Ezra. That means that even if one wants to say that the texts of the Cyrus Cylinder and Ezra are two separate decrees, problems still arise within the biblical text as it paints Cyrus as somebody he was not, at least according to what is written on the cylinder. The Bible, at least in this paradigm, is not a historical source, as it seems to be treating this declaration as a theological text, not a historical narrative. We're going to look at that in a second, but if I just remind you what I said at the beginning, here's where the tension starts if you're trying to treat the Bible, or any of the books of the Bible, as a historical text. Because suddenly you're going to come into conflict with an external source that cannot be dismissed. It's there. You need to find a way of reconciling that source with what you've got in the Bible. You need to come up with an explanation as to why the Bible would have said something which seems to conflict completely with that which we understand from somewhere else. It is possible to say that Cyrus issued one decree, and they're both represented differently, one in the Cyrus Cylinder, one in Ezra. And he issued the decree to all the people in his empire, but that he was, as the Bible asserts, religiously motivated, so not politically motivated. Listen to this. Such an approach also has problems, for if Cyrus's demonstration of respect towards deities was a reflection of religious belief, then the king was contradicting himself. There is no way that Cyrus believed in a Jewish God and then violated the cardinal tenet of Judaism, which is monotheism, by believing in Marduk. In other words, if Cyrus truly only believed in the God of the Jews, as it says in Ezra, then he must have been a monotheist who did not believe in Marduk. However, the Cyrus Cylinder clearly says that Cyrus acknowledged this pagan god. Now, another possibility is that this Babylonian primary source is a lie. How's that possible? Well, it's possible because it could be that whoever inscribed the Cyrus Cylinder and etched out all those letters and words misrepresented Cyrus's declaration as being about Marduk, who was a Babylonian deity, so you can see why a Babylonian would want to represent it as being about Marduk, when in reality he'd said, if you replace every time it says Marduk in the Cyrus Cylinder with the word Elokei Yisrael, well, then you have quite a different declaration. That might work. Now, according to this theory, there was only one declaration, and it was about the Hebrew God, but then a Babylonian or possibly Persian propagandist recorded it with a Babylonian twist to make it attractive to a Babylonian audience. Don't forget, they'd conquered Babylon. They now needed to, I guess, make sure the Babylonians didn't fight back. Well, if Cyrus's declaration is made to the Babylonians in terms of their deity and made to the Jews in terms of their deity, Babylonians don't know Hebrew, and the Hebrews don't know Babylonian, and no one's reading each other's declarations, and each one is perfectly happy to see that Cyrus the Great loves their God. Which God did he believe in? Well, if you read Ezra, you'll believe that he believed in God of the Hebrews. I guess if you're an ancient Babylonian, that wouldn't matter too much because you'd believe he believed in a Babylonian God. There's not that many descendants of ancient Babylonians who believe in Marduk. There are lots and lots of people who believe in a monotheistic God. So they want to believe the Ezra version, not the Cyrus Cylinder version. Finally, it is also possible that as the Bible is clearly not a history book, it records something which I like to refer to as a theological history, or a version in which Cyrus's tolerance for all faiths is understood as a divine plan to allow for the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. The record of the declaration is therefore presented to deliver this contextualized understanding of the ending of the exile and the resettlement in Jerusalem. Cyrus may have said one thing, but what he was actually saying was that which God wanted him to say through the medium of our Torah. actions are what determines what comes out of Cyrus's mouth, at least in the context of us, the audience, 2,500 years later. His actual words, while they may be of interest to historians, are of no interest to meta-historians, which is what we are. We're interested in the meta-history of the Persians and the Persian Empire and the resettlement of Jews in the Holy Land, and therefore in terms of what he actually said, I'm afraid it's theologically irrelevant. The only relevant part of his decree for us, the Jewish people, is his acknowledgement of God and his permission for the Jews to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. So did he say the words in Ezra? Or did he say the words recorded on the Cyrus Cylinder? In the end, I'm afraid we will never know. For the purposes of Judaism, only what is said in Ezra is relevant. We will leave it here for today. Thank you.